Imagine walking into a one-room schoolhouse in 1830s America. The air smells faintly of chalk dust, damp wool coats, and the faint smoke of a wood-burning stove in the corner. The benches are rough, narrow, and unforgiving. Sunlight filters through wavy panes of glass, cutting across rows of restless children fidgeting with ink-stained fingers. At the front stands the teacher, not a kindly figure with gentle eyes and soft encouragement, but a stern, watchful presence. In his hand rests a long hickory switch, thin enough to whistle when swung, sturdy enough to raise welts on the skin. This wasn't decoration, it wasn't theatre, it was the real authority in the room. You see, before detention slips, after-school cleanups, or suspension policies, discipline in 19th century American schools often meant one thing: physical pain. Spanking, whipping, caning, switching. These weren't the last resort, they were the first line of order. And so a child might walk home from school not with a gold star, but with red stripes across the back of their hands. A poor penmanship exercise might end in a whipping. Whispering in class? Another strike. Forgetting your spelling words? You might be bent over the desk for a sharp reminder. This wasn't unusual. This wasn't scandalous. This was normal. What's fascinating and slightly chilling is how ordinary people defended this system. Parents often supported it, ministers preached about it, teachers relied on it, and the children who endured it sometimes grew into adults who repeated the cycle, believing that pain was the path to discipline, morality, and good citizenship.
Tonight, we're going to wander slowly and carefully into this world. We'll explore how corporal punishment shaped 19th century American classrooms, why it was believed to be necessary, and what it says about the culture that produced it. We'll uncover the strange and sometimes brutal tools teachers used, from the hickory switch to the ferule, a flat wooden paddle, from the dreaded dunce cap to the humiliating practice of making children kneel on hard kernels of corn. We'll see how these punishments carried both practical and symbolic meaning, reinforcing not just obedience, but hierarchy, morality, and control. And along the way, we'll also notice something peculiar. Even in this harsh environment, children found ways to resist, joke, and even bond over the shared sting of discipline. Much like sailors with their moldy hardtack or factory workers with their endless bells, school children crafted tiny cultures of survival. The story of school whippings isn't only about pain. It's about what Americans in the 19th century believed education should accomplish and what they were willing to do to achieve it. It's about how culture bends children into adults, not just through books and lessons, but through ritual, fear, and yes, sometimes a sharp whack across the knuckles. So as we step into this creaking wooden schoolhouse together, imagine yourself among those children. The scratch of slate pencils, the shuffle of leather shoes on the floorboards, the silence that falls when the teacher's switch makes that faint, whistling sound through the air. This is the classroom before detention. This is the world where order was carved not just into memory, but into skin.
If you were to open a teacher's desk drawer in a 19th century American schoolhouse, you wouldn't find much in the way of colourful stickers, smiley face stamps, or prize boxes. No gold stars tucked away. Instead, you might discover an assortment of instruments designed for one purpose: correction. The most infamous of these was the hickory switch. Thin, supple, and cut fresh from a tree, it had the unnerving ability to whistle through the air before it struck flesh. Teachers prized it for its efficiency, light enough to handle swiftly, flexible enough to sting without breaking, and readily available in nearly every rural landscape. If the switch wore out, well, another branch was always just outside the schoolhouse door. Children dreaded not just the switch itself, but the ritual around it. Sometimes a misbehaving student was sent to fetch their own branch, forced to choose the very instrument that would be used against them. The psychology of that walk outside, searching among trees for the right thickness, the right length, it was a punishment before the punishment. And if the branch chosen was too thin, too fragile, back outside they went until the teacher deemed it worthy. Then there was the ferule, a flat piece of wood, sometimes more paddle than ruler, sometimes more ruler than paddle. Its favored target was the palm of the hand, where even a sharp strike left an instant reminder. Teachers believed it instilled discipline and corrected laziness. To the children on the receiving end, it was simply pain disguised as pedagogy. The sound of a ferrule cracking down on wood or flesh was as much a part of the schoolhouse as the drone of recitations.
But physical pain wasn't the only tool. Humiliation had its own set of instruments. The dunce cap, for example, a tall cone often placed on a child's head as they were forced to sit or stand apart from classmates. It transformed mistakes into public spectacle, making disobedience or slowness visible to everyone. To wear the cap was to be marked as less intelligent, less worthy. The punishment lingered long after the cone was removed. And then came the kernels of corn, a strangely American invention of cruelty. Children might be forced to kneel for hours on dried kernels, sharp edges biting into their knees. This punishment combined endurance, shame, and pain in one neat package. Unlike the swift sting of a switch, this was slow, grinding, and relentless. It turned every second of kneeling into a silent plea for relief. Even everyday classroom tools could become weapons of discipline. Rulers snapped across knuckles, slates smashed over heads, ink thrown in anger. The line between object and punishment blurred in a way that modern classrooms can scarcely imagine. Yet here's what's strange. To many 19th century Americans, none of this seemed especially cruel. It was order, it was morality, it was what serious education required. Discipline and punishment were believed to be inseparable, two halves of the same coin. Without one, the other failed. So, in the one-room schoolhouse, the presence of a hickory switch wasn't questioned. The ferrule hanging by the blackboard wasn't protested. Even the bag of corn kernels kept in a corner was not seen as unusual. They were simply the accepted grammar of schooling, written not in ink, but in pain. To modern eyes, these punishments feel brutal, even barbaric. But for a child in 1840, they were as ordinary as reciting multiplication tables. The schoolhouse was a place where you learned letters, numbers, and the precise sting of disobedience. And perhaps that's what makes this era so haunting. Education wasn't just about filling the mind. It was about shaping the body, disciplining the spirit, and proving that order could be carved as easily into skin as into memory. So when we picture those rows of children hunched over their slates, whispering under breath, or nervously watching the teacher's hand rest on a ferrule, we're not just seeing history, we're seeing an entire philosophy of control, a belief that learning without fear was no learning at all.
To understand why spanking and corporal punishment thrived in the one-room schoolhouses of 18th and 19th century America, we have to step back into the broader mindset of the time. To parents and teachers, discipline wasn't just about classroom order, it was about morality, the soul, and even the survival of the nation's future. One of the most quoted lines in early America came not from a teacher's manual, but from the Bible: "Spare the rod, spoil the child." Though not a direct biblical phrase, its roots trace to Proverbs. "He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes." The message was clear. Discipline wasn't cruelty, it was love in action. To leave a child undisciplined was to doom them to sin, folly, and ultimately ruin. In Puritan New England, this philosophy ran deep. Children were believed to be born with sinful tendencies, wayward and stubborn, and it was the sacred duty of parents, and by extension teachers, to correct them. Schoolmasters weren't just instructors, they were moral guardians charged with keeping young souls on the narrow path. The rod, the switch, the ferrule, they were as much tools of salvation as of education. By the 19th century, this religious justification had blended with a rising American emphasis on self-discipline and productivity. The young republic needed industrious citizens, not idle dreamers. A child who could endure pain in the schoolhouse was being prepared, so the logic went, for the hardships of adult life: farm work, factory labor, military service, or civic duty. Discipline at school was a rehearsal for discipline in society. And then there was the family dimension. Many parents not only accepted corporal punishment in schools, they expected it. To them, a teacher who did not punish was neglecting their responsibility. Letters and diaries of the time reveal parents who openly encouraged teachers to use the rod if needed, believing it to be a sign of proper authority. In fact, a teacher who was too lenient risked losing respect from both parents and students alike.
But beneath this stern philosophy lay another layer: fear. Early Americans lived in an age of uncertainty. Plagues, wars, crop failures, unpredictable economies. Order was precious, chaos dangerous.
Punishment, then, was not only about shaping children, but about reassuring adults that society itself was being controlled, one classroom at a time. A well-disciplined school was a symbol of a well-disciplined nation. This worldview also explains why public humiliation was so integral to school punishments. A child forced to wear the dunce cap or kneel on corn wasn't just enduring pain, they were enduring shame. And shame was a social glue. It reinforced hierarchy, reminded students of their place, and warned others what happened if they strayed. Discipline wasn't private, it was a performance, one that reinforced the collective belief that strictness was necessary. Even reformers of the 19th century, those who questioned the harshest punishments, rarely dismissed discipline altogether. Instead, they argued for better methods of correction, more measured, less cruel, but still rooted in the belief that correction was essential. Few dared to suggest that children could be guided without fear or pain. That idea wouldn't gain traction until the late 19th and 20th centuries, and even then, it was controversial. To us, it's a paradox. How could love and violence be so closely intertwined in the minds of parents and teachers? But to a family in 1820, spanking wasn't a contradiction. It was the very definition of care. To let a child grow without correction was to abandon them, to risk their future. The sting of a switch was framed not as harm, but as salvation. And so, in the 18th and 19th century schoolhouse, every swat of a ruler carried more than just physical impact. It carried centuries of theology, tradition, and fear. Each lash was both a punishment and a prayer, a hope that through pain, a child might be molded into virtue. It's this mindset that made corporal punishment not just tolerated, but expected. And it's why for so many generations of American schoolchildren, the sound of learning was indistinguishable from the sound of discipline.
Imagine it's a cold morning in rural America, sometime in the 1830s. The sun hasn't fully risen, and frost clings to the windows. A boy trudges toward the little wooden schoolhouse, carrying a slate under one arm and a piece of firewood under the other. Every student was expected to bring fuel for the stove, or risk the teacher's displeasure before lessons even began. Already, discipline was embedded in routine. Forgetting your log might mean a stern lecture, or worse, a swat to remind you of your duties. Inside, the schoolhouse is cramped and bare. Wooden benches line the room with no desks for younger pupils. The air smells of ink, chalk, and smoke from the iron stove. Children of all ages, some as young as 5, others in their teens, sit together, fidgeting, whispering, or staring blankly ahead. The teacher, often no more than a teenager themselves, stands at the front with a ruler in hand. Lessons were simple, but demanding. Reading, writing, arithmetic, those were the pillars of education. Students copied letters onto slates, read passages aloud, or recited multiplication tables in chorus. The sound of voices chanting in unison filled the air, a sing-song rhythm that could last for hours. For children who stumbled, stuttered, or dared to drift, punishment hovered like a shadow. A wrong answer might mean standing in the corner with the dunce cap. A wandering gaze might earn a sharp rap across the knuckles. But punishment wasn't just for mistakes. Order itself was the highest value. Talking out of turn, whispering to a neighbour, laughing, or even sitting with poor posture could trigger correction. Teachers often kept a ferule on the desk, ready to strike palms or shoulders. The very sight of it was a silent threat, shaping behaviour long before it was ever used. Some punishments were creative, even theatrical. A child caught daydreaming might be forced to balance on one leg for long minutes, or to hold a heavy book outstretched until their arms ached. Students accused of laziness could be made to sit on a stool wearing a placard labelled "idle," visible to the entire class. Mischievous boys sometimes found themselves lashed to one another with rope, forced to march around the room until they reconciled their quarrel.
The rhythms of the day left little space for comfort. Breaks were short, often just enough time for a drink of water or a hurried snack from home. Lunch might consist of bread, cheese, or cold leftovers, eaten quickly at a wooden bench. Even recess wasn't entirely free. Teachers often kept watch, ready to punish children who played too roughly, climbed too high, or used their freedom a little too joyfully. And yet, children found ways to endure. They whispered jokes when the teacher's back was turned, carved initials into desks, or passed secret notes under slates. Some even found humor in the punishments themselves, mocking classmates who wore the dunce cap, or turning a forced posture into an exaggerated pantomime. For many students, laughter was as essential to survival as obedience. It's easy to imagine the exhaustion at day's end. Hours of memorization, chanting, recitation, and the looming threat of punishment left little room for joy. Yet, for many families, this education was a privilege. In communities where farm work dominated life, schooling was often seasonal, squeezed between planting and harvest. Missing a day wasn't unusual, but missing too many could mean being left behind in lessons, a fate teachers corrected with even harsher strictness. Parents reinforced this system. A child punished at school might find themselves punished again at home, parents siding with teachers rather than children. Stories abound of students arriving home in tears only to receive another spanking from their father for having earned the schoolmaster's wrath. In such an environment, the message is clear. Authority was not to be questioned, and pain was both the language and currency of education. The one-room schoolhouse was thus more than a place of learning. It was a crucible of discipline, a stage where obedience was rehearsed daily through lessons and punishments alike. To survive it required not just literacy and math skills, but a finely tuned sense of caution, endurance, and even cunning. And yet, within this stern system, bonds formed. Children shared hardships, whispered rebellions, and the occasional triumph of outsmarting their teacher. The classroom may have been strict, but it was also the seedbed of American memory, where generations learned not only their letters, but the strange lesson that knowledge and pain were often taught hand in hand. If you stepped into a 19th century American schoolhouse, one of the first things you'd notice, besides the smell of chalk dust and damp wool, was the collection of disciplinary tools kept close at hand. These were not tucked discreetly away. They were displayed, often right on the teacher's desk, like silent sentinels. Each had a purpose, each carried a story, and each was designed to leave not only a mark on the body, but an impression on the mind. The ruler was the most familiar. Made of wood, sometimes with brass edges, it was both an instrument of measurement and a weapon of correction. A light tap on the desk warned a class into silence. A sharp smack across the knuckles stung for minutes. Teachers learned to wield rulers with theatrical flair, lifting them high before striking, or snapping them against their palm to send a crack echoing across the room. A single sound could silence chatter faster than any word. Beyond rulers came the rod. Spare the rod, spoil the child wasn't just a phrase, it was a philosophy. Hickory sticks, willow switches, and wooden canes were common companions in schoolhouses, each chosen for its sting and its durability. Boys especially knew the bite of the rod across the backside or legs, while girls often endured swats on the hands. Parents rarely objected. In fact, some encouraged teachers to keep a firm hand and viewed marks left by a switch as evidence of good teaching. Then there were the more creative implements. Leather straps were used in some schools, folded and doubled for maximum sting. A flat paddle could be swung across a desk, sending books flying and students scrambling into silence. In certain communities, teachers devised homemade tools, a split board that pinched skin, or a wooden spoon swung with surprising force. Not all punishments required striking. The dunce cap, tall and conical, was perhaps the most humiliating tool of all. Placed on a child who failed a lesson, it was less about pain and more about spectacle. The wearer was forced to sit on a high stool at the front of the class, a visual warning to others. Sometimes the cap was decorated with insulting words like fool or idler, ensuring maximum shame. In some schools, students were made to wear donkey ears or carry a wooden sign marking their crime. These punishments worked through laughter and ridicule, turning classmates into an audience of enforcers.
Restraint was another theme. In certain cases, misbehaving children were tied to chairs or had their hands bound with rope to stop fidgeting. Some teachers even used a contraption called the finger stocks, a wooden clamp that locked small fingers into place for hours. It was crude, uncomfortable, and deeply memorable. Other stories tell of children made to kneel on dried peas or corn kernels until their knees burned, a simple kitchen punishment imported straight into the classroom. The blackboard itself sometimes became a tool of humiliation. Wrong answers were written in chalk for all to see, with the guilty child forced to stand beside them. In more theatrical schools, children were made to wear signs around their neck, whisperer, tardy, or liar, like public confessions. Every object in the room, from the chalk to the benches, could be repurposed as a tool of correction. Perhaps most unsettling was the casualness with which these punishments were applied. A ruler strike could follow a wrong answer as naturally as chalk follows a slate. Teachers carried rods the way a farmer carried a walking stick. Some even carved notches into their canes to mark each punishment delivered, a grim tally of discipline served. The classroom was not only a space of learning, but a stage where authority was performed, reinforced, and ritualized daily. Yet even within this strict environment, there were gradations. Some teachers believed in measured correction. Short, sharp lessons meant to sting but not injure. Others took pride in harsher methods, boasting of their ability to break the spirit of a troublesome boy. Students knew the difference. The memory of a cruel teacher's rod could linger for decades, retold in hushed tones long after the welts had faded. For the children, these tools became symbols. The ruler meant vigilance, the rod meant fear, the dunce cap meant shame. Together, they created a landscape where learning was inseparable from discipline, where every object carried the possibility of punishment. Over time, students adapted. They learned to anticipate, to avoid, to outwit. A sharp glance at a teacher's hand resting near the ruler might be enough to silence a giggle. A whispered joke could be timed carefully when the rod was leaning against the far wall. In this strange dance of authority and resistance, the tools of discipline played as central a role as books or slates. And so, the one-room schoolhouse was not only filled with lessons of grammar and arithmetic, it was filled with the constant presence of objects that promised pain, shame, or restraint. To grow up in such a place meant to carry these memories forward, etched as much into the body as into the mind.
Now, if we step away from the rigid halls of schools and the rough-and-tumble world of taverns, we find another place where spanking made itself at home in the 19th century, the household. Yes, domestic discipline was not only accepted, but often expected. Husbands, wives, and even extended family members believed that correction through physical punishment was simply part of keeping a household in order. To our modern ears, it may sound shocking, perhaps even cruel, but for many families in 1800s America, spanking was woven into the fabric of daily life. Children were the most common targets. Parents, especially fathers, believed in the phrase, "spare the rod, spoil the child." It wasn't just a saying, it was an instruction manual. A father might keep a switch, paddle, or belt hanging in plain sight as both a warning and a tool. It was less about hiding punishment in shame and more about making it a visible, constant reminder. If a boy misbehaved, perhaps he skipped chores, mouthed off, or dared to play a prank on the neighbors, a spanking was considered the natural, even loving response. Parents argued that a sting on the backside today prevented a lifetime of crime tomorrow. That was the logic. But here's where it becomes more complicated and perhaps more unsettling. In many parts of rural America, neighbors and extended kin felt they had the right to discipline children as well. An aunt, an uncle, even a family friend could administer a spanking if they caught a child misbehaving. In towns where everyone knew everyone else's business, the line between private family life and community authority blurred. Imagine walking home from a mischievous errand only to be stopped by a neighbor woman who thought you deserved a few quick swats before you made it to your own doorstep. The child might then receive a second helping of punishment from his parents once he walked through the door. Double jeopardy, 19th century style.
It's worth noting that mothers, too, carried out spankings, sometimes more often than fathers, since they were home with children throughout the day. A wooden spoon or a slipper might be employed for swifter corrections. Diaries and letters from the time reveal mothers confessing that they felt torn between affection and discipline, but they almost always leaned on discipline. After all, raising obedient children was seen as a mother's sacred duty. A disobedient child reflected poorly on her character, and so a spanking was often as much about preserving the family's reputation as it was about teaching lessons. Domestic discipline didn't end with children, however. In some households, particularly in religious or tightly structured communities, spanking extended to adults. Yes, there are recorded cases of husbands spanking wives for disobedience, though this practice was controversial even at the time. Some men defended it as a way to keep peace at home, while others argued that such behaviour bordered on cruelty. The debate even spilled into newspapers on occasion, with editorials arguing whether a husband had the right to discipline his wife physically. Disturbing though it is today, these debates reveal how deeply ingrained corporal punishment was in the culture of the time. The irony, of course, is that many families believed spanking was an act of love. It was supposed to shape character, instill humility, and prepare children for the hardships of life. And perhaps in some ways it did, but it also left behind bruises, both physical and emotional, that lingered long after the stinging hand or switch had done its work. Yet the act of spanking at home was not always solemn or severe. In certain cases, it even had a touch of dark humour attached to it. Imagine children whispering about who got the slipper that day, or siblings warning each other not to get caught. For some households, the ritual became almost predictable. Mischief, the scolding, the spanking, the tears, and then, just as quickly, the return to routine. Dinner was served, chores resumed, and life moved on as if the punishment was simply another chore in the family's day. So when we look at 19th century America, it's clear that spanking in the home was not seen as scandalous or shameful. It was ordinary. It was expected. It was woven into the very definition of what it meant to raise children and keep order. And in a century filled with change, migration, and uncertainty, perhaps spanking represented a kind of anchor, a familiar ritual in a world that often felt unstable. Of course, whether it was truly effective or merely a cycle of pain passed from one generation to the next, that's something history leaves us to ponder.
If there was any place where spanking took on a kind of moral authority in 19th century America, it was within the church. For many believers, corporal punishment wasn't just a personal choice, it was a divine command. The Bible itself was quoted as justification, with verses like "spare the rod, spoil the child," serving as rallying cries from pulpits across the young nation. Ministers reminded parents that discipline wasn't just cruelty, but rather a sacred duty. To raise a child without spanking, they warned, was to invite sin into the home and risk eternal damnation. Sunday schools, which sprang up all across America in the 1800s, often carried this philosophy straight into their classrooms. These were supposed to be places of gentle moral instruction, but misbehavior, whispering during lessons, skipping memorization, or showing disrespect, could quickly result in swift punishment. A wooden ruler across the knuckles or a spanking behind closed doors was not unusual. In some rural churches, misbehaving children might even be disciplined in view of the entire congregation. Imagine being marched to the front pew for everyone to watch as you received a public correction. The lesson wasn't just for you, it was for every child in the room. And it wasn't just children who felt the sting of religiously sanctioned punishment. Congregations sometimes disciplined adults too. In small, tightly knit churches, members were expected to uphold strict moral codes. A parishioner who drank too much, argued too loudly, or defied church authority could be summoned before elders. While most punishments were verbal, confessions, apologies, even temporary excommunication, some church communities took it a step further. Stories survive of adults being whipped or spanked in semi-public rituals, often framed as corrections of the flesh meant to cleanse the soul. The reasoning behind all this was simple but chilling. Pain was believed to drive out sin. Ministers often preached that discipline was a form of love, and without it, the flog would stray. Parents in the pews listened closely, nodding along as their beliefs were reinforced. To many families, spanking became not only a household duty, but a spiritual obligation. A child's cries, they thought, were proof that evil was being driven out, much like smoke rising from a fire.
The Great Awakenings, those waves of religious revivalism that swept across America, only strengthened these views. Preachers roared from tents and pulpits about sin, obedience, and the importance of strict discipline. They painted vivid pictures of what happened to children who weren't corrected. They grew into lawless adults, drunkards, thieves, or worse. The cure, of course, was discipline, often physical. It was seen as saving not just the child's future, but their very soul. Some churches even developed structured rituals around corporal punishment. In certain sects, children were spanked on Sundays if they had misbehaved during the week, a kind of weekly reckoning. This turned discipline into something almost ceremonial, an act tied to the rhythms of worship and repentance. To parents, this regularity offered reassurance. Order was being restored, and God's law was being upheld in the household. But not everyone agreed. By the late 19th century, reformers, many of them Quakers and early child welfare advocates, began questioning these practices. They argued that constant spanking taught children fear rather than faith, obedience without understanding. These critics worried that harsh religious discipline could push young people away from the church rather than toward it. And in a few corners of America, quieter, gentler forms of child rearing began to emerge, though they remained in the minority for decades.
Still, for most of the century, religion and spanking were inseparable. The church was not only a place of prayer and community, but also a place where the rod was blessed, sanctioned, and preached as holy. For families already accustomed to discipline at home, this spiritual endorsement only added weight. Parents left Sunday service with the comforting reassurance that their methods weren't merely practical, they were righteous. And so, from pews to pulpits, the sound of discipline echoed. Spanking was never seen as cruelty, it was seen as salvation. And when we look back, it's impossible to separate the practice from the deep religious roots that fed it.
Not every spanking in 19th century America was deadly serious. Oddly enough, many were played for laughs. If you flip through old newspapers, dime novels, or even theatre scripts of the era, you'll notice how often spanking turned up as a source of humour. What we might consider grim or embarrassing today was, in those days, ripe for slapstick. In cheap stage plays and travelling vaudeville shows, for example, a character caught in mischief often ended up bent over while another delivered a comical spanking to the delight of the crowd. The exaggerated cries, the flailing arms and the mock scolding were all part of the performance. In a society where corporal punishment was ordinary and expected, audiences didn't see it as cruel, they saw it as relatable. Everyone knew what it felt like to get swatted, so the shared recognition sparked laughter rather than outrage. Newspapers and satirical magazines carried the same theme. Humour columns often described spankings in absurd, over-the-top ways. A mischievous farm boy sent flying over the fence by his father's hand, or a husband taken to task by his wife with the flat of a broom. These stories, whether true or embellished, played into the idea that a good spanking was not only corrective, but also entertaining. Readers chuckled at the image of domestic justice being served with flair. Cartoons from the 1800s are especially revealing. Editorial artists, who often relied on exaggeration, loved to depict politicians or social figures being metaphorically spanked for their mistakes. A corrupt official might be drawn over Uncle Sam's knee, receiving a playful swat as a lesson in honesty. These drawings turned punishment into a visual joke that made a political point while also giving readers a laugh. Spanking was so commonplace in everyday life that the metaphor needed no explanation. Even children's literature, those moralistic little storybooks sold in corner shops, sometimes played spanking for humour. Tales about naughty boys sneaking pies or little girls refusing to sew often ended with a comical spanking scene. The message, of course, was serious: obey your parents. But the illustrations, with their exaggerated tears and puffy faces, often bordered on cartoonish. To young readers, the lesson was clear, but to adults, the humour wasn't lost either. There's also evidence of spanking contests creeping into the culture of entertainment. Sailors, lumberjacks, and other working communities occasionally staged playful spanking duels, where the challenge was to withstand a certain number of swats without crying out. These events were often accompanied by drinking, laughter, and lots of egging on from spectators. It blurred the line between discipline and sport, turning what was normally a private punishment into a form of public amusement. Of course, not everyone laughed. Critics worried that making light of corporal punishment dulled its seriousness. Religious reformers argued that discipline should be solemn, not humorous, and certainly not a stage gag. But in an era when physical correction was as ordinary as sweeping the floor, it wasn't easy to convince the public that laughter was inappropriate. It's worth noting too how this humor shaped memory. Children who grew up seeing spanking in plays or reading about it in jokes often absorbed the idea that it wasn't just normal, it was funny. By weaving corporal punishment into the fabric of entertainment, society ensured it wasn't questioned, but instead reinforced through laughter and spectacle. Looking back, it's striking how spanking moved so easily between the worlds of fear and humor. One moment it was a stern household ritual, the next it was a punchline in a comic strip. This duality helped keep the practice deeply embedded in American life. As long as people could laugh about it, they could live with it. And so, whether in a crowded vaudeville theatre, a newspaper's humour column, or a woodcut cartoon of a politician getting a symbolic swat, spanking became part of America's public stage. It wasn't just a private act of discipline, it was a cultural symbol, open to mockery, exaggeration, and play. There's also evidence of spanking contests creeping into the culture of entertainment. Sailors, lumberjacks, and other working communities occasionally staged playful spanking duels, where the challenge was to withstand a certain number of swats without crying out. These events were often accompanied by drinking, laughter, and lots of egging on from spectators. It blurred the line between discipline and sport, turning what was normally a private punishment into a form of public amusement. Of course, not everyone laughed. Critics worried that making light of corporal punishment dulled its seriousness. Religious reformers argued that discipline should be solemn, not humorous, and certainly not a stage gag. But in an era when physical correction was as ordinary as sweeping the floor, it wasn't easy to convince the public that laughter was inappropriate. It's worth noting too how this humor shaped memory. Children who grew up seeing spanking in plays or reading about it in jokes often absorbed the idea that it wasn't just normal, it was funny. By weaving corporal punishment into the fabric of entertainment, society ensured it wasn't questioned, but instead reinforced through laughter and spectacle. Looking back, it's striking how spanking moved so easily between the worlds of fear and humor. One moment, it was a stern household ritual, the next, it was a punchline in a comic strip. This duality helped keep the practice deeply embedded in American life. As long as people could laugh about it, they could live with it. And so, whether in a crowded vaudeville theater, a newspaper's humor column, or a woodcut cartoon of a politician getting a symbolic swat, spanking became part of America's public stage. It wasn't just a private act of discipline, it was a cultural symbol, open to mockery, exaggeration, and play.
Yet not all voices were in agreement. The latter half of the 19th century saw reformers raise their concerns. Educational thinkers like Horace Mann and Catherine Beecher began to argue for moral suasion instead of brute force. They believed that reason, persuasion, and structured routines could shape children more effectively than spankings. Some religious leaders joined this cause, suggesting that over-reliance on physical discipline hardened children's hearts instead of guiding their souls. Still, reform came slowly. In rural America especially, where teachers were often barely older than their students and classrooms were full of rough farm boys, the rod was seen as indispensable. Without it, many believed, chaos would reign. Even into the late 1800s, observers traveling through frontier towns often remarked on the sound of a switch cracking across a desk or a teacher barking warnings as part of the normal background noise of schooling. There's another wrinkle here, the role of gender. Boys, unsurprisingly, bore the brunt of school discipline. Teachers, male and female alike, believed boys were naturally unruly, full of mischief, and in need of taming. Girls were disciplined too, of course, but often in ways considered more modest or restrained. A smack across the hand or a tug at the ear was more common for girls, while boys were bent over desks for paddlings. The difference reveals how deeply gender expectations shaped even the pain children endured. The public nature of these punishments also mattered. A spanking in the middle of class wasn't just about one child, it was a message to the entire room. Every cry, every shuffle of feet, every red face was a warning to others. This is what happens if you stray. In some cases, teachers even used humiliation as part of the punishment, making a child stand in the corner, wear a dunce cap, or sit on a full stool. The sting of the rod was temporary, but the shame could linger far longer. Looking back, one might wonder how children managed to learn under such conditions. Yet, in a strange way, discipline was part of the education. Students didn't just memorize their lessons, they internalized the social values of order, respect, and submission to authority. Spanking was a language, a ritual of hierarchy, and every swat was another sentence written into the body about who held power in the classroom. By the end of the 19th century, debates about school discipline had grown louder, especially in cities where progressive educational theories were taking hold. But for much of rural America, the paddle remained as essential as the chalkboard, and so generations of children carried both their letters and their bruises home, proof that school had shaped them in more ways than one.
If the schoolhouse was strict, the Army and the Navy were positively unforgiving. Discipline in 19th century America's military institutions was not just about obedience, it was about survival. A ship at sea or a regiment in the field couldn't afford hesitation, disobedience, or laziness. Every man had to know his place, and punishment was the tool to enforce it. And yes, spanking, whipping, and flogging all had their place in this world of order. Naval discipline especially loomed large. The wooden decks of U.S. Navy ships in the early 1800s carried echoes of the British tradition, swift corporal punishment for infractions ranging from drunkenness to backtalk. The infamous cat-o'-nine tails was the most brutal implement, reserved for severe crimes like theft or desertion. But for lesser offences, a simple spanking with rope's end or flat board was a common corrective. These weren't playful swats, but stinging reminders that obedience was not optional. Records from naval court-martials showed that sailors could be punished for sleeping on duty, failing to salute properly, or even being slow to climb the rigging. A few strikes administered before the crew did the trick. It restored authority, demonstrated fairness, at least as the officers saw it, and discouraged others from slipping. Publicness mattered. Just as in the classroom, punishment on deck was theatre. A sailor bent over the capstan while an officer applied lashes was a warning to everyone watching. The sea was no place for disobedience. The army was little different. While flogging was officially banned in the U.S. Army in 1812 and later in the Navy in 1850, alternative corrections continued in practice, often euphemistically described as minor punishments. Among them were beatings with belts, wooden paddles, or even the flat of a sword. These were not meant to incapacitate, but to sting, humiliate, and remind soldiers of the absolute chain of command.
And humiliation was half the point. Soldiers who disobeyed might be punished in front of their regiment, made to bend, to wince, to absorb strikes while their peers looked on. Discipline was not just physical, it was psychological. A man who endured a spanking without protest was branded as humbled but salvageable. One who resisted, who shouted, fought, or tried to run, was marked as dangerous, possibly unredeemable, and often faced harsher retribution. One curious twist appears in frontier garrisons and militias, where informal discipline thrived. Officers lacking the elaborate codes of big institutions, sometimes improvised with punishments that were closer to schoolhouse correction than military law. A drunken recruit might be laid across a barrel and spanked with a strap before being sent back to drill. Others reported being struck with the flat of a rifle or forced to endure a mock spanking, in which humiliation carried more sting than the blows themselves. It may sound strange to modern ears that grown men, soldiers, sailors, defenders of the nation, endured punishments we often associate with children. But therein lies the logic. The military and navy sought to reduce individuality, to break down pride, and to make obedience second nature. The message was clear. No matter how strong you thought you were, the institution was stronger. Submission to pain and authority was part of your training. And while the lash and paddle eventually faded from official practice, echoes lingered. Even after the Navy banned flogging in 1850, sailors continued to describe unofficial corrections, often carried out quietly below deck. Similarly, while the Army's regulations forbade corporal punishment, drill sergeants and officers had wide latitude, and many used physical correction well into the Civil War era. Letters from recruits often mentioned being boxed about the ears, strapped, or soundly spanked for sloppiness in drill. Of course, reformers protested. Mid-century critics argued that corporal punishment degraded the dignity of soldiers, weakening the very morale it was meant to enforce. They called it barbarous, unrepublican, and fit only for despots. Newspapers occasionally published scandals about excessive beatings, feeding the growing reform movements. But change was uneven. On the frontier, in wartime, or aboard ships far from Washington, D.C., old habits clung stubbornly. So what can we make of this? In the 19th century, military spanking was more than discipline. It was a ritual of submission. It was the visible line between the individual and the collective, a bodily reminder that freedom had its limits when you wore the uniform or climbed the rigging. The sting faded quickly enough. The memory and the lesson lingered. In towns and villages across 19th century America, law enforcement was often less about professional police officers and more about neighbors, elders, and communities enforcing their own rules. And sometimes, justice came not in the form of a courtroom, but in the sting of a paddle, a switch, or a quick spanking delivered in public. Think of it as frontier democracy with a sharp edge. Communities valued order, but they also valued thrift and efficiency. Trials were expensive, jails were few, and punishments needed to be swift, visible, and corrective. For petty crimes, stealing apples, breaking windows, insulting elders, or shirking communal duties, the community itself often stepped in. A culprit might be hauled into the town square, bent over a barrel or fence, and spanked before the eyes of neighbors. It was shame, discipline, and spectacle rolled into one. The practice wasn't merely about pain. Public spanking carried layers of symbolism. It reduced the offender, whether child, teenager, or adult, to a state of childishness, stripping away pride and reminding them that they had broken the moral order of the community. It said, in effect, "You've behaved like a child and you'll be treated like one." This humiliation could sting more than the blows themselves, especially in small towns where gossip traveled faster than wagons. Court records and newspaper snippets from the early 1800s make it clear that this was not rare. Local justices sometimes ordered corporal chastisement as a sentence for minor offences. In New England villages, town records describe offenders being whipped upon the green. On the frontier, where formal courts lagged behind population, neighbours administered corrective swats with belts, rods, or hands. Some of these incidents were structured like mini-trials, the accused brought before elders, the evidence recited, the punishment swiftly applied. But at other times, it was rough-and-ready mob justice. A thief caught red-handed might find himself pulled into a barn, his hands pinned while community members applied a dozen sharp spanks as a warning. Mischievous youths often bore the brunt. Teenagers caught vandalizing, sneaking liquor, or playing pranks were spanked publicly to set an example. Parents sometimes watched, approving the lesson. The message was unmistakable. Society itself could parent you if your own parents failed.
And let's not forget the darker edges. Public spanking could become ritualized humiliation for women accused of impropriety. In some frontier communities, women suspected of gossiping too freely, scolding, or stepping outside social norms faced the rough music tradition. Dragged out at night, jeered by neighbours, and sometimes spanked or paddled as part of their shaming. These punishments carried the weight of social policing, an effort to enforce roles, maintain order, and remind everyone where the lines were drawn. What made this practice so enduring was its theatrical nature. Unlike fines or confinement, spanking created a story people remembered. Children whispered about the boy who was spanked behind the church for stealing hymnals. Adults retold the tale of a drunkard who was soundly corrected by his neighbours. Every swat echoed in the collective memory of the community, discouraging future mischief. Interestingly, community spanking blurred the line between justice and ritual. It wasn't always punitive, sometimes it was preventative. A wayward youth might be given a taste of punishment before he went too far down a dangerous road. In other words, a symbolic spanking today might save him from the gallows tomorrow. Harsh, yes, but framed in the logic of the era, it was mercy by pain. And while reformers in the mid-19th century began to push for more rational forms of punishment, fines, probation, reform schools, the old customs didn't vanish overnight. In rural America especially, public spanking as community justice lingered into the late century. When institutions were distant, neighbours remained the judges, the jury, and quite literally the disciplinarians. So while courts and laws expanded, communities never fully abandoned the idea that a sharp slap or spanking was both correction and deterrence. It was quick, cheap, symbolic, and above all, memorable.
Life in 19th century America was full of rules, rituals, and, occasionally, a sharp smack to remind you of them. Whether in schools, towns, or even households, spanking was less about cruelty and more about order, an efficient, immediate, and memorable way to teach lessons. Communities, parents, and employers alike used it as a tool for discipline, deterrence, and social cohesion. Public punishments turned shame into spectacle. A few swats could broadcast a moral lesson louder than any lecture, etching behaviour and boundaries into the collective memory. Children learned what not to do, apprentices learned respect, and towns reinforced their social norms, all under the watchful eyes of neighbours and peers. Yet beyond practicality, there's something human in these customs. Spanking wasn't just about punishment. It reflected a culture navigating scarcity, isolation, and the constant challenge of raising the next generation in uncertain times. It was ritual, theatre, and social glue wrapped into one sharp motion. By looking back, we see how communities relied on both creativity and force, blending practicality with performative discipline. Today, these practices seem strange or even shocking, but they reveal a lot about 19th century priorities: order, respect, and a belief in learning by experience, sometimes very literally across the backside.
Ultimately, the legacy of spanking in early America isn't just about the strikes themselves. It's about a world where human behavior, social control, and cultural norms collided in ways both absurd and fascinating. And in that collision, we glimpse how ordinary people managed childhood, crime, and propriety long before modern institutions took over.